Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at your conference today. My name is Julie Nelson and I'm from the National Foundation for Educational Research, or the NFER, in England. And I'm going to talk to you today about some research that we've conducted recently about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on schools in England. So I'd like to start by giving a little bit of context about the presentation that I'm going to give today. It's based on two large-scale rapid school surveys that we conducted between May and July last year to investigate the impacts of COVID-19 on schools. Just to say a little bit about the research, it was jointly funded by the Nuffield Foundation, which is a charitable trust in England which funds research on social policy, particularly in education, welfare and justice. And it was also funded by ourselves at the NFER. We're an independent organisation that produces independent, high-quality research to inform key decision-makers about issues across education. And the work was also led by myself and colleagues here at NFER. Okay, now I'm aware that many people attending the conference today won't know very much about the England context, so I'm just going to take a minute to take you through a quick timeline of how the government has responded to the COVID pandemic in England and how that's impacted on schools. So it all started on the 20th of March in 2020, when in the face of rising COVID rates, the government ordered all schools in England to close to all pupils apart from a very small number. It also cancelled national examinations and most pupils from that point onwards were learning remotely. This carried on until the 1st of June, when primary schools opened their doors to some pupils in some year groups, but not all year groups. And then on the 15th of June, secondary pupils in years 10 and years 12 were allowed back into school for just some face-to-face support, but all other pupils remained learning at home. So during this period, the majority of pupils were still learning remotely. After the summer holidays and in early September, schools reopened fully to all pupils, but there were localised COVID outbreaks during that period, and so schools had to respond to that by offering a blend of on-site and remote learning quite often. And then sadly in the new year, as you may have seen in the news, the rates of COVID in England really started to surge again, and in that context government was forced to order all schools in England to close again, and again cancelled national examinations as well. So just a little bit of context now about the research that we conducted. As I mentioned previously, it was based on two large-scale surveys in May and July of 2020. And each of those surveys received responses from around 3,000 school senior leaders and teachers across just over 2,000 schools. And we conducted statistical survey weighting to ensure that the surveys were representative of schools in England. A little bit here about what the surveys were focused on. They had slightly different points of reference. So the first one was very much to find out how pupils were engaging with remote learning during the period of full lockdown. The second survey was more to take a look at the impact that the lockdown had had on their learning, the extent to which they'd fallen behind, and the apparent need for catch-up. So I'm going to talk now about the impact of school closures in England. And what we find here as a key finding really is that all pupils have been impacted by this pandemic. And we can see here that it's had a substantial impact across a number of different measures. So pupil engagement in learning, parental engagement in their pupils' learning, pupil access to IT, and also the extent to which the curriculum was being covered as normal. And what we can see here in the statistics in the right-hand column is that engagement was relatively low. And we also, across all measures, found a waning effect. So the further into lockdown things went, so the lower the overall levels of pupil engagement were. And additionally, when schools partially reopened in June 2020 to pupils in some year groups, we also found that attendance among those groups was low, with senior leaders reporting to us that only 56% of the pupils eligible to attend school at that time actually did so. And their main reasons for saying that were that parents were really worried about their pupils' safety. And I think the second finding that I'd like to draw to your attention really is that we found that pupils in the most deprived schools have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So in all respects, pupils in schools with a high level of deprivation were suffering more as a result of the pandemic, and you can see this on this slide. So the most deprived schools are in the left-hand column, and the least deprived schools are in the right-hand column. So not only were they and their parents less likely to be engaging in remote learning, but they were also receiving less curriculum coverage from their schools than their peers in more affluent schools, which indicates a substantial learning equity issue. This is very likely to have been exacerbated by their much higher levels of need in relation to IT. So you can see from the table here that 2/5 of young people in the most deprived schools had limited access to IT, compared to only 1/5 in the least deprived schools. So yeah, real cause for concern there. Okay, so now I'm going to talk through a few of our findings on the equity of remote learning. And I just want to pause on this slide for a minute, because this is the kind of image that we're often presented with when we think about what remote learning might be like. And I'd like to suggest that it presents a somewhat idyllic picture of remote learning. We can see what's probably a parent and 2 young children engaging with what look to be live streamed lessons. And this suggests that a few different things are going on. So firstly, it suggests that parents are engaging in their children's learning, but we know from our previous slide that only just over half of parents were in May, and that this figure had fallen by July. It also suggests that pupils had ready access to digital devices and broadband. And again, we already know from our research that around 1/4 of pupils in England really didn't have this kind of access at all. And then finally, it also suggests that teachers were live streaming their lessons. And as I'm going to show you in the following slide, this was actually quite rarely the case. Okay, so as we can see from this slide, this graph is showing us that, looking at the situation in May anyway, most schools were typically setting work for their pupils in lots of different ways, and they were sending it home for them to complete. The most common approaches were using online content from other providers, asking pupils to work from worksheets or textbooks, or asking them to read a book in their own time. What we found was that very few schools were actually using active forms of teaching, such as live lessons. Only 15% of schools were doing this. Or any kind of online conversations with pupils. That was only 12% of schools that were doing that. And when we resurveyed schools in July, we found that they were no more likely then to be offering interactive teaching approaches than they were earlier in lockdown. Anecdotally though, in the new academic year, it does seem that many more schools are now offering live learning to their pupils, but we're going to need more research to really understand and examine the extent to which this is taking place. And I think there's a number of reasons for this apparent move. So firstly, schools have had a lot more time to organise their processes and their IT systems, and also to train their staff. And also, they've done their very best to try and improve the supply of laptops to children with poor IT access. But also, the government's now mandated that schools must provide online teaching to pupils, which has undoubtedly presented challenges for schools, but they're also doing their very best to meet that requirement. So when we looked a little bit more deeply, we also found that there was a real lack of equity in terms of pupils' access to remote learning. And in this graph, we focus on whether senior leaders thought their pupils were getting involved in the activities that teachers were setting them. So it's a slightly different measure to the one before, which was about pupils returning set work. This is a slightly softer measure, which is why we see slightly higher levels of pupil engagement. And in this graph, primary schools are illustrated in the purple line and secondary schools in the green line. And then off to the left are the most disadvantaged schools, and off to the right are the most affluent schools. And we found that on average, around 2/3 of secondary and primary pupils were engaging with the work that they were being set at some level. But we can also see a really clear disadvantage gradient in this graph. So if you follow the green line, for example, you'll see that fewer than 50% of secondary pupils in the most deprived schools were engaging with the work their teachers were sending them, compared to almost 80% in the most affluent schools, which is a really huge difference. We also found that engagement was lower among pupils with special educational needs, vulnerable children and young carers. And all of this paints a really concerning picture and suggests that the pandemic is having a widening effect on a disadvantage gap that was already present before the pandemic. We also conducted some statistical modelling to have a look at the factors that influenced the higher and lower levels of pupil engagement that we identified through our surveys. So in the left-hand column here you've got factors that we found to be associated with lower levels of pupil engagement, and in the right-hand column factors that were associated with higher levels of pupil engagement. I'm not going to talk through all of these in detail now, but what I want to do is draw out some implications from what you can see there on the table yourselves. So I think the first implication is that clearly schools serving the most disadvantaged pupil populations need more government or local support and resources than they're getting at the moment. Secondly, teachers, particularly inexperienced teachers, need training and support in this new form of teaching. There was a sort of assumption really that they were going to be able to just turn their hand to online learning overnight, and that wasn't the case. And then thirdly, it's the case that all schools should be supported to have a virtual learning environment for communication and learning purposes. We found that schools that used this kind of technique had much higher levels of pupil engagement. In our second survey, we also found that not all teachers had the right access to IT themselves to work effectively from home or to offer effective remote learning. 35% of them were providing their own laptop, 41% were supplying their own recording equipment, and we found that 21% had no access to these kinds of facilities at all. So clearly that's something too that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Okay, and to finish up with now, I'm just going to talk about some of our findings in relation to the impact that the pandemic has had on pupils' learning in England. And we can see from this graph that all pupils had fallen behind compared to normal expectations at this time of year. So in our second survey, we asked teachers to provide an estimate of how far behind they thought pupils were compared to where they would normally be. And on average, they estimated that pupils were about 3 months behind with their learning. And this broadly mirrored the amount of curriculum that teachers said they had covered, which was around about 2/3 of what they normally would have covered at that point in the year. But we also found that pupils in the most deprived schools were the most behind. So in this graph, the least deprived schools are shown in the purple bars and the most deprived schools are shown in the orange bars. We can see here that teachers in schools with a high level of deprivation were 3 times more likely to say that their pupils were 4 months or more behind where they would normally be. So this suggests that the disadvantage gap that I mentioned earlier was most definitely widening, which is clearly very concerning. Okay, so I've talked through a number of our key findings today. So I'd like to just take a moment to reflect on some conclusions from our work and some of the things that clearly need to happen now. So firstly, government resources and funding do need to be prioritised for the most disadvantaged schools. Teachers need high quality training and they need to be better resourced so that they can do their jobs highly effectively. Government also needs to speed up the distribution of laptops and internet connectivity to disadvantaged pupils, especially those in disadvantaged schools, so that we can improve the equity around remote learning. Schools themselves need to identify strategies for learning recovery for all their pupils, but particularly for the most disadvantaged. And then finally, we need some new research now on the extent to which schools have managed the switch to live learning. This is a really interesting development, and we need to understand how schools are finding it, how well it's going, and where the outstanding challenges lie. So I'd like to leave you with some of those thoughts to think about as you progress through your conference today and hear about the situations in many different countries who are grappling with this pandemic in different ways. I'd like to just finish by highlighting some information about our research so that you can find it if you'd like to take a look. And this slide shows you a link that will take you to NFER's website where we have a number of publications on this research. And there's also my email address and my Twitter handle. Please do feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like to discuss. Thank you very much and best wishes for your conference.